December 6, 1917, Halifax, Nova Scotia, 9:04 in the morning. On a Thursday. The sun is out, the harbor is busy, children are at school, dock workers are on their shifts. A fire truck has just pulled up to a hydrant near the waterfront, where a ship has been burning for the past 20 minutes. And almost everyone in the north end of the city has stopped to look at it. They're standing on their porches, leaning out of doorways, pressed up against windows. School children, factory workers, housewives, merchants, watching a burning ship drift slowly through the harbor. Curious, calm, safe. Seconds later, roughly 1,600 people are dead or dying, and the final toll will climb far higher. Not from a bomb, not from an enemy attack, not from a natural disaster anyone could have predicted. From a ship that no one ran from, because no one understood what it was carrying. This is the story of the Halifax Explosion, the largest man-made blast in human history before the atomic age. A disaster that didn't have to happen, that nobody stopped in time, and that killed an entire neighborhood before anyone had a chance to move. To understand what happened in Halifax on December 6, 1917, you need to understand what Halifax was. By the time the First World War entered its third year, Halifax had become one of the most strategically important Allied ports on the North Atlantic. Its harbor was deep, ice-free year-round, and positioned perfectly on the North Atlantic shipping lane between North America and Europe. Troops, food, fuel, and war material moved through the harbor in enormous volumes, as convoys assembled there for the crossing to Europe. The city had swelled to accommodate all of it. 65,000 people by 1917. The docks were running around the clock. The naval fleet was growing. Factories were humming. Halifax was prosperous, vital, and indispensable to the Allied war effort. But that same importance had created a problem no one had solved, and no one was trying to solve. Dangerous cargo of every kind was now moving through a port that sat directly beside dense residential neighborhoods. The Richmond district, one of the city's most tightly packed working-class communities, ran right along the northern waterfront. Families lived within sight of the docks. Schools sat a few hundred yards from the piers. There were no buffer zones, no separation between the industrial harbor and the people who lived beside it, no evacuation plan, no protocol for what to do if something went wrong, because the system had never been asked to imagine something going wrong. Further along the Bedford Basin shoreline, a neighborhood called Africville sat tucked against the water's edge. Home to a community of Black Nova Scotians, many of them descendants of Black loyalists who had come to Halifax after the American Revolution. Africville had its own church, its own social fabric, its own deep roots in the city. It also had something else, a long history of being overlooked by the municipal government that collected its taxes. The roads were unpaved. City services were sparse. The community survived on its own terms, as it always had. In peacetime, the proximity of all these neighborhoods to the harbor was manageable. In wartime, with the volume of traffic Halifax was handling, with munitions and fuel passing through a channel barely wide enough for two ships to pass, it was something else entirely. And on the evening of December 5, 1917, both pieces of that something else were already in the harbor. The first ship was the SS Mont-Blanc. From the outside, she was unremarkable. A French cargo vessel, about 320 feet long, not particularly large, not particularly impressive. You would not have looked at her twice in a busy wartime port. But below deck, she was carrying the single most dangerous cargo ever assembled on one vessel in Halifax Harbor. 2,300 tons of wet picric acid, a highly explosive compound used in artillery shells, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and 35 tons of benzol, high-octane fuel stored in barrels on the open deck, directly above everything else. Any one of those components was dangerous on its own. All of them together, in a single ship, in a congested harbor, in a city of 65,000 people, it was, by any measure, unthinkable. And yet there she sat, because the war needed her there, because the convoy schedule said so, because the system that moved ships through Halifax Harbor had already decided that speed mattered more than caution. The Mont-Blanc had sailed up from New York, where she'd been loaded under strict secrecy. Her orders were to proceed to Halifax, join a military convoy assembling in Bedford Basin, and cross the Atlantic to Bordeaux. Her captain was Aimé Lemedec, an experienced mariner, careful by disposition, fully aware of what his ship was carrying, which is exactly why he had made one decision that would matter more than almost any other. He had not raised the red warning flag. Under normal peacetime practice, a ship carrying dangerous cargo would have flown a warning flag, a visible signal to other vessels that it needed a wide berth. But wartime secrecy had made that practice far less consistent. Le Medec had chosen not to use it. His reasoning was not reckless. German submarines were hunting Allied ships across the Atlantic, and a red flag on a cargo vessel was as good as a sign that read, "We are carrying something worth sinking." He had decided that the risk of U-boats outweighed the risk of a harbor collision. It was a rational decision, a wartime calculation made under the same pressures every Allied captain was navigating. It was also the kind of decision that only makes sense inside a system that has already accepted an extraordinary level of danger as normal. That same evening, harbor pilot Francis Mackey boarded the Mont-Blanc to guide her through the harbor the following morning. Mackey was experienced, one of the most skilled pilots working Halifax Harbor. He knew the Narrows well. He knew the traffic patterns. He knew the risks. He asked about a protective escort for the ship, given her cargo. He was told none was available. The second ship was the SS Imo. Where the Mont-Blanc was a vessel of war, the Imo was a vessel of mercy, chartered by an international relief organization to carry donated food and clothing to civilians trapped in German-occupied Belgium. She was empty on this leg of the voyage, heading to New York to pick up supplies, and in a hurry. She had been held in Halifax Harbor longer than expected due to a fuel delay, and her captain, a Norwegian named Håkon From, wanted to make up the lost time. 2 ships, 2 experienced captains, 2 experienced pilots, both on legitimate wartime missions, both about to enter the same narrow stretch of water at the same time. The Narrows is the channel that connects Halifax's outer harbor to Bedford Basin, the inner anchorage where convoys assembled before crossing the Atlantic. About a mile long, maybe 900 feet wide at its narrowest point. For 2 large ships moving in opposite directions, that is not a lot of room. On the morning of December 6th, the Mont-Blanc entered from the south, moving toward Bedford Basin. The Imo was coming the other direction, outbound for open water. They spotted each other from about a mile out. By standard maritime rules, both ships should have been passing port to port, each keeping to their own right side of the channel. But the Imo had been maneuvering around slower vessels and had drifted to the wrong side. She was on the Mont-Blanc's side, and closing fast. What happened next took less than 20 minutes. It felt, to the men on both bridges, like it took less than 20 seconds. Mackey, aboard the Mont-Blanc, gave one short blast of the ship's whistle. "I am here. I have the right of way. Move aside." The Imo responded with 2 short blasts. "I am not moving." Mackey swung the Mont-Blanc toward the Halifax shore to open up space. The Imo altered course, in the same direction. The gap closed again. Another signal, another correction. Each ship reacting to the other, each adjustment undoing the one before it. The distance between them shrinking with every exchange. At approximately 8:45 a.m., the Imo's bow struck the Mont-Blanc on her starboard side, just forward of the bridge. The collision itself was almost gentle, in the way of ships, maybe 1 knot of relative speed. The Imo ground along the Mont-Blanc's hull and pulled away. No one died. No one was seriously injured. Both ships were still intact. But on the Mont-Blanc's deck, the barrels of benzol had ruptured, and a spark had found them. A flicker, then a flame, then a growing column of black and orange smoke rising from the Mont-Blanc's forward deck. Below that fire, separated by a few feet of steel hull, sat 2,300 tons of explosives. Captain Le Medec and pilot Mackey understood immediately what the fire meant. There was no saving the Mont-Blanc. There was no putting the fire out before it reached what was beneath it. The ship was a fuse, and it was burning. They ordered the crew to abandon ship. The men of the Mont-Blanc lowered their lifeboats and rowed hard for the Dartmouth shore, the far side of the harbor, away from the city. As they rowed, they shouted warnings, in French, to a waterfront that spoke English. The burning ship, unmanned and adrift, began to move with the tide, toward Pier 6, toward the Richmond district. The Halifax Fire Department received the call within minutes. Engine number 6, the station closest to the waterfront, raced toward the harbor and pulled up near the pier. The crew jumped out, began connecting their hoses, and prepared to fight what looked like a ship fire. They had no idea what the ship was carrying. The correct response to a burning Mont-Blanc was not to fight the fire. It was to run. But nobody had told them that. Nobody could. And while the firefighters worked, the people of Halifax watched. Children crowded to school windows. Teachers let them. Families stepped out onto porches in the cold December air. Workers on the docks set down their tools. Neighbors called to each other. There were people who had worked the Halifax waterfront their entire lives. People who had seen dozens of ship fires. And nothing in their experience told them this one was different. There was no alarm, no evacuation order. No one in any position of authority understood what was burning in the harbor. So the city did the most natural thing in the world. It stopped and looked. The fire burned, the smoke rose, the Mont-Blanc drifted, and at 9:04 a.m. she reached Pier 6 and ran aground. There were people on that pier, in the buildings behind it, in the houses on the streets above it, in the schools 2 blocks back from the waterfront. There was a fire truck parked 20 feet away, its crew connecting a hose. There were children standing at windows throughout the Richmond district, faces pressed against the glass. 17 minutes had passed since the collision. The benzol had burned down to the hull. The Mont-Blanc exploded. The explosion released the equivalent of 2.9 kilotons of TNT. A pressure wave expanded outward from Pier 6 at the speed of sound, devastating the north end and destroying or wrecking structures across a vast radius in the time it takes to blink. The Richmond district, the dense working-class neighborhood that had grown up along the northern waterfront over generations, was erased. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, erased. Streets, houses, factories, churches, schools, gone. A mushroom cloud rose 3 miles into the sky above Halifax Harbor. The sound was heard on Prince Edward Island, more than 200 miles away. The shock was felt in Cape Breton, in New Brunswick, in communities across Nova Scotia that had no idea what had just happened. The Mont-Blanc herself was vaporized. Her anchor, 1,000 pounds of iron, was blown nearly 4 miles and landed in the woods on the far side of Dartmouth. The fire truck from engine number 6 was found 3 kilometers from where it had been parked. Into the harbor, the explosion pushed the water back. Then the water returned. A tsunami surge, 60 feet above the normal high water mark, crashed against the shores of the Richmond district and Dartmouth simultaneously. It pulled people off the waterfront, swept through the lower streets, dragged wreckage and bodies into the harbor. Ships in the basin were lifted and thrown. The Imo, the Norwegian relief vessel that had started everything, was picked up by the wave and driven aground on the Dartmouth shore, where she sat listing for days, visible from across the harbor. Then came the fires. The explosion had scattered burning debris across hundreds of acres. Dozens of fires ignited simultaneously, in homes still standing, in collapsed buildings where survivors were trapped, in warehouses and factories along the waterfront. Some burned for hours, some burned for days. About 1,600 people were killed almost instantly. The final known death toll would reach at least 1,782, and is often rounded to nearly 2,000. 9,000 more injured. Burns, crush injuries, puncture wounds from debris traveling at speeds no human body was built to survive. And the eyes. When the Mont-Blanc detonated, windows shattered inward across Halifax and Dartmouth, and the people of Halifax, the people who had stopped to watch the burning ship, were standing at those windows, faces against the glass, eyes open. The blast drove those windows inward like walls of razors. About 250 eye removals were performed in the 2 weeks that followed. 41 people were left permanently and totally blind. Hundreds more lost partial vision. The concentration of eye trauma from a single event was unlike anything doctors had seen before, or would see again until the atomic bombings of the next war. The Halifax Explosion, along with the growing number of blinded veterans returning from the First World War, helped lead to the founding of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind in 1918. The people who were blinded were not people who had ignored a warning. They were people who were curious, who did exactly what any of us would have done on a clear December morning when something unusual was happening in the harbor. They walked to the window to see. In the chaos of the burning Mont-Blanc drifting toward Pier 6, almost no one on the Halifax waterfront understood what was about to happen. Almost no one. Vince Coleman was a telegraph dispatcher at the Canadian Government Railways station in the Richmond district, less than half a mile from Pier 6. He was 29 years old. He had a wife, he had children, and on the morning of December 6th, a colleague ran into his station and told him what the burning ship was, what it was carrying, and that he needed to run. Coleman got up from his desk. He started for the door. Then he stopped. An express passenger train from St. John, New Brunswick was inbound on the Richmond line, hundreds of civilians aboard, scheduled to arrive at the Richmond station, a station about to be at the center of the largest human-made explosion the world had yet seen, within minutes. Coleman turned around, sat back down at his telegraph key, and began transmitting. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6. Goodbye. The train stopped outside the city. The passengers survived. Vince Coleman died at his desk. The morning of December 7th, Halifax woke up, what was left of it, to a blizzard. One of the worst winter storms of that year descended on the city overnight, dropping 16 inches of heavy, wet snow on the ruins of the Richmond district. Rescue workers who had been digging through debris by hand were now digging through debris and snowdrifts. The temperature dropped. The fires still burning met the snow in a confusion of steam and smoke and freezing water. Survivors who had made it through the explosion, people who had crawled out of collapsed buildings, who had been pulled from the harbor, who had been lying in the open waiting for help, died of exposure in the hours after the storm hit. The blizzard did not end the disaster. It extended it into a second day, and yet the response had already begun. Within hours of the explosion, military personnel, naval crews, doctors, nurses, and volunteers were working in the ruins. Improvised hospitals were set up in whatever buildings were still standing. Trains arrived from across Nova Scotia, carrying supplies and medical personnel. The city of Truro opened its doors to the homeless, but it was Boston that moved fastest. Within hours of news reaching Massachusetts, the Commonwealth had organized a relief train. Doctors, nurses, medical supplies, tents, food, blankets, and dispatched it north through the same winter storm that was burying Halifax. The Massachusetts teams were on the ground and working before some Canadian officials had fully processed what had happened. Halifax did not forget. More than 100 years later, the province of Nova Scotia still sends a Christmas tree to the city of Boston every December. Not a ceremony, as memory. 1 week after the explosion, before the bodies were all recovered, before the fires were fully out, before the blizzard had even finished, the government convened an inquiry. Nearly 2,000 people were dead. An entire district of a major Canadian city had been destroyed. The largest man-made explosion in history had occurred in a civilian harbor on a clear Thursday morning. Somebody had to answer for it. The Rec Commissioner's inquiry convened on December 13, 1917, at the Halifax Courthouse. It lasted several weeks. It called witnesses, reviewed the signal exchanges, reconstructed the movements of both ships, and examined the decisions made in the Narrows on the morning of December 6th. Its conclusion was swift and confident. The fault lay with the Mont-Blanc, specifically with Captain Lemedec and pilot Mackey, who the inquiry found had failed to take adequate precautions given their ship's cargo. Both men were charged with manslaughter. Both were eventually acquitted on appeal. The inquiry also cited Commander F. Evan Wyatt, the Royal Canadian Navy officer responsible for managing harbor traffic, for failing to ensure that a munitions ship received appropriate oversight. The Imo's crew was largely absolved, but that was not the final legal word. Later appeals, including the Supreme Court of Canada and the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, held that Mont-Blanc and Imo were equally at fault for the navigational errors that led to the collision. Historians have spent more than a century pushing back on that verdict, not because Lemedec and Mackey were blameless, but because blaming two men on one ship allowed everyone else to avoid a harder question. The harbor was the problem. A system that funneled the full arsenal of a world war through a 900-foot wide channel bordered by homes and schools and churches. That was the problem. A wartime logic that had decided speed mattered more than safety, that convoy schedules mattered more than evacuation planning, that the risk of U-boats outweighed every other risk. That was what had put the Mont-Blanc in the Narrows that morning. Individual men were tried. The system was not. Out of the rubble of the Richmond district, a new neighborhood rose. The Halifax Relief Commission, which would remain active until 1976, nearly 6 decades after the explosion, making it one of the longest-running disaster relief efforts in recorded history, oversaw one of the most ambitious reconstruction projects in Canadian history. The destroyed North End was not simply rebuilt as it had been. It was redesigned. Fire-resistant concrete construction replaced the timber frame homes that had burned. Streets were widened. Drainage was improved. Building codes were rethought from the ground up. The centerpiece was a development called the Hydrostone, named for the distinctive concrete blocks used in its construction. Rows of terraced homes, modest but solid, built to a uniform standard along tree-lined streets. One of the earliest modern planned communities in Canada and the country's first government-assisted housing project. A neighborhood built by a disaster, designed to survive the next one. The Hydrostone still stands today. People still live there, but not every community was rebuilt. Africville, the black neighborhood along the Bedford Basin that had been part of Halifax for generations, was hit hard by the explosion. Homes were damaged. Families were displaced. The community needed the same assistance that was flowing into the Richmond district. Materials, funding, infrastructure, support. Very little of it came. Africville received little of the large-scale reconstruction support and investment that reshaped other parts of Halifax after the explosion. Africville's residents were left to rebuild on their own. The new building codes, the investment in housing, the planned reconstruction, almost none of it reached them. The marginalization that had defined Africville's relationship with Halifax before December 6th continued without interruption after it. The disaster changed everything in the north end of the city, except who was considered worth rebuilding for. Africville was eventually demolished by the city of Halifax in the 1960s, under the banner of urban renewal. Its residents were displaced a second time, decades after the first. That, too, is part of what December 6, 1917 left behind. There is a tradition in Halifax, observed every year on December 6th, of gathering at Fort Needham Memorial Park, on a hill in the north end of the city, on the edge of what was once the Richmond district, looking out over the Narrows. They ring a bell, they read names, they remember. Vince Coleman's telegraph key is on display at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax. A small, unremarkable piece of brass and steel, the kind of object that would mean nothing out of context. In context, it is the most important object in the room. Remember Halifax. Remember the people at the windows. And remember that the gap between an ordinary morning and catastrophe is sometimes nothing more than a ship, a spark, and 17 minutes.